Okay, good morning, Raj. Are you here?
There's some connection problem. Just give me some time, please.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me.
Hello, good evening,
Hello?
madam.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Good morning, where I am.
Oh, okay. Here, I am Dr. Mani Misra.
Hi, nice to meet you. So I'll go ahead and start then, the class. Hi. Welcome back. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I am Dr. Corey Gala. I am happy to be back. I'm a little bit sluggish today, a little bit sleepy. I've had a rough time sleeping the past few nights. I think there's a lot of things going on in the planets and in the energy on the planet and with the humans and with the earth itself. And I'm very sensitive to these things. So I'll get into that a little bit today, trying to bring us back to where we were last week, organize my thoughts a bit. And again, this class is on holistic medicine, holistic wellness, and herbal remedies. So the holistic aspect, again, just to reiterate, is body, mind, soul, and spirit. Spirit being the broader sense of our existence, the cosmic beings, if you will, the magnetic energies of the planet, however you choose to describe that. Spirit could be considered to be the heavenly realm or the demonic realm or the gods, or again, if you're even atheist, I guess you would consider that maybe just that energetic, magnetic energy that is out there that we are sensitive to, although we're not always tuned into it. So bringing us back to last week when we were discussing animism and the perspective of animism, which again, to repeat, is the understanding that all things have individual spirits. And this is a prevalent belief system among native, indigenous, tribal cultures, and that would be globally. So that is quite common in most tribal cultures. So there's always this acknowledgement of individual spirit. And so there's reverence paid to these individual spirits. And last week I did share one of my Hawaii stories about the animals on the mountain, the eo, the hawk, the ohia, the trees, and keakua, the heavens, which would again be the spirit realm. So when we are speaking about soul, body, mind, soul, spirit, soul, it would be considered to be our individual soul. So that would be our individual energetic force. And when we get into esoteric concepts, which do come into play when we're talking about holistic well-being and wellness, we have this concept, and I touched on it just briefly, of this microcosm, macrocosm, or as within being a reflection of without, as without, sorry. So what we see on the outside is really a projection of what's inside. And we went into Ho'oponopono a little bit with the prayer work where we have that microcosm within us, and then that macrocosm without us, or that within without, and as we heal within, that healing is also translating energetically to the broader world. So these are, kind of, I think as Queen Nadia would call them, there's some spiritual laws, but these would be considered to be esoteric wisdom or spiritual concepts, philosophical concepts that do go into play in the broader sense when we're talking about holistic well-being and health, because we recognize that we don't want to neglect any aspect of our existence, whether that be in the physical, in the mind, or the thinking, in the soul, which is that energetic principle, that heart center, maybe that emotional sense, that intuition that we get, and then the greater, broader existence, which would be spirit. So I'm just going to share a couple more Hawaii stories with you, or Hawaii, I should pronounce it correctly. And that is bringing into play the idea of mind. So mind and spirit. So I'm going to try to do a crossover between the two, between Western science and thinking in neuroscience and ideas of brain and how that affects our physiology, emotions, and how that affects our physiology and our well-being, and how that translates with spirit and the broader existence, or in animism, the spirits of those sentient and non-sentient beings that we share the planet with, right? Because the rocks and the waterfalls and the mountains and the sky all have their spirit as well, which is recognized in indigenous cultures, in tribal cultures. So I did write down some notes here because I do have a lot of interesting stories. So when we're talking about spirit, that is, so I'm briefly touched on, I think, one of the first classes, that I have had visions since I was a very small child. And the West, it was very difficult to understand those things and make sense of those things, because we deny that aspect of our existence, especially in the mechanistic, pragmatic, analytical, scientific West, that if it is not seen and tested and retested, then it doesn't exist. So for someone growing up being very sensitive to these energies, it was very difficult for me. So I learned to shut these visions down. But what happened was that I ended up feeling them all in my body. So because I could not define them, because I did not have teaching that I needed in order to understand what was happening, I began to feel that physically. And science is now recognizing this, and there are studies being done on individuals who maybe have a sense of a deeper empathy, or just a sensitivity to other people's suffering or what's going on around them. And so for me, that was everything. The animals, even the rocks. I can remember feeling the pain of mountains when they would be digging into the mountains. I could feel all this life, right? We talked a little bit about microbes and microorganisms. So there's all of these levels of existence and all of these like little microcosms, when we talk about that fit into this larger macrocosm. And there's all of these other worlds, whether we're going into a microscopic world or we're going out into space to look at the broader sense of our existence. And so being tuned into that as a child, and then in a culture that denies that, was quite challenging, which is probably how I ended up on my interesting journey. And I feel that it was guided on some level, must have been guided. But visions, I wanted to touch on briefly. If we think about Jungian psychology and we think about archetypal or archetypes, and I did speak just briefly about universal language. So pictures or images are universal. For the most part, most images, things that we see, photographs, a smile, certain things that we see generally are cross-cultural in nature. Not all. Some cultures have different practices, you know, where where they may not interpret those images as such in a universal sense. However, art or archetypes have a sort of an unspoken general impression and understanding. So imagery is a very wonderful way to communicate around languages if we do not know the language. So I will say that I believe that seeing things or having visions of things is a universal form of communication. I think in Christian theology, when they talk about speaking in tongues, sometimes I think of this universal language as pictures, images, because it has the ability to supersede language, and people can gain an understanding from that, and that becomes universal. I would say music can carry that. And then, of course, we talked about mathematics, which is a universal language. However, not everyone has knowledge and understanding. So the two stories I was going to share about Hawaii before we move forward, one is a surf story about the honu, which is a turtle. And again, I was living on the Big Island, and I was in the rainforest. My goal was to create a sustainable eco sanctuary for healing, and I was trying to protect these ohia trees. I did have a run-in with the volcano, so I did live very close to the crater, and there was a volcanic eruption, and many things happened, and it was very intense, and I'll just leave it there. But it was my time to leave the island shortly after that, and I understood that. So I lived very close to nature. So I was in an ancient forest with acres and acres and acres of these virgin meaning like old growth forest. And there was a forest preserve that backed up to the property where I was, and then I was nestled in on an 8-acre property of these trees and ferns, these habu'u ferns, and it was very magical. I had animals, lots of animals, and grew medicine. And what I did for pleasure was surfing, and so I brought up surfing. Now, surfing is quite sacred to the Hawaiian people. It originated in Hawaii. There is this rhythm with the ocean. You have to understand this rhythm with the ocean in order to surf. Of course, you have to be a very strong swimmer, and the currents are very powerful. And I really liked very, very big waves. So it's a very dangerous sport. But I was passionate about it, and I started it as a child. And it was traditionally a sport that was reserved for the ali'i. So it was a sport of nobility, and the best surf spots were reserved for the ali'i, or the noble class. So it has a really rich tradition. It was brought back to the world in the 1940s, I believe, by the Duke, and they called him Duke, and he spread surfing around the globe. It was starting to have a little bit of a revival, I think, before that. I don't want to get too into the history because I haven't refreshed my memory, and this is from probably 20 years ago when I studied it, so I don't want to talk about too many of the details at this time, but it has a very rich tradition. And so, before you go into the ocean, you pray, you pule. You always pule. You always acknowledge Keakua, if you want to call it God. There's a lot of Christian influence since the missionaries came to Hawaii, so they blended a lot of their ancient Polynesian Hawaiian cosmology and religion with the Christianity. They have their own sort of little blend, and then that kind of has many different, it's kind of on a spectrum of belief systems. So I would not say that there is one broad reaching belief systems. So there's the ancient Polynesian, Hawaiian gods and goddesses, this concept of animism and spirit family. Hawaiians draw their ancestry way back and are offspring of the kalo plant, which is very important food source plant for them. Kalo, which is or taro, and kalo being the Hawaiian name, taro being, I believe, the Tahitian name. If I'm not mistaken, I might be mistaken. So if I am, please correct me on that, or don't hesitate to correct me on that. And that is the plant you'll see in Waipio Valley, many of the valleys. It's a root plant. It's a starch. It's how they make poi. They pound it. And that is a staple food source. So the first humans came from the kalo or the taro. It was very controversial in Hawaii when they were talking about making GMO kalo plants, because GMO is manipulating the DNA. So when we're talking about GMO seeds, of course, I am not a proponent of GMO. I am a permaculture advocate, regenerative agriculture, bringing back the soil microbes, bringing back traditional farming practices because of this understanding of these microcosms, these macrocosms, and these entire worlds that might be under our microscope, right? And this balance, this beautiful balance that nature has. So there was controversy because when you're manipulating the DNA, that is basically would be manipulating the Hawaiian ancestry DNA. So they won that fight. Monsanto has a very large presence in the Hawaiian Islands. There's a lot of GMO corn that they use for biofuels. It's very controversial. Lots of things going on over there that are very controversial because you have the still native practices going on. A lot of very passionate environmental advocates, a lot of very passionate, permaculture and sustainable farming people over there. And then you have these large corporations that are trying to take hold over there as well. So that's just a little bit of a sidestep there, politically speaking. But getting into the surfing again. So going into surfing, and this is where I'm going to do this little crossover between our mind and our brain chemistry and what would be seen as spirit from an animistic, non-empirical perspective. So I went out surfing, and you have to understand that in Hawaii, I was on the Big Island. And so when you get really big waves, what's happening when you get a very big wave is that you're coming from a very deep water source, because Hawaii is an island, right? So the island comes up from the bottom of the ocean, right, and out of the ocean, and then you have the shoreline here. But if you go out just a ways, you really are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, like as middle of the Pacific Ocean as you can get. If you go out just a little bit further, there's like a shelf, and then it's just a drop off into the very, very deep, deep, deep ocean, right? So what happens is when you have the waves coming, you have this large body of water coming, and it hits this shelf, right? And all that water pitches up very high and causes these very, very, very large waves. But as you come in close to the shoreline, it gets very, very shallow. And Hawaii itself, Hawaii Island, is a very new island. So it hasn't had time for lots of erosion. And it's also volcanic in nature, right? So there's a lot of very large, jagged lava rocks, very shallow. So maybe 4 feet deep, 6 feet deep when you're surfing, and you might be on a wave that's 10 feet, 15 feet, right? So very big wave, very shallow. And you also have the coral. And coral's very, very sharp. And then you have the vana, which they would call vana, which is sea urchins. So they're poisonous, sharp, and spiky. There's little tube worms, which are sharp, very sharp. I have a lot of scars on my feet from when you wipe out. You have to fall flat. They say fall flat because it's very shallow. So it's unlike if you were surfing in a mainland, if you're surfing in California, if you're surfing in Australia, you're talking about it's a gradual progression into the deeper water. And so it's like deep water surfing. The bigger waves are in deeper water, and then it's usually a flat, sandy bottom. So you don't have that same experience as when you're surfing on a reef. I mean, there are reefs. I mean, there's a huge Great Barrier Reef. So don't let me talk about Australia. I'm thinking more California. But there are some little reefs there and rock jetties and things like that. It's just very, very different when you're in extremely shallow waters with very, very jagged rocks under you. So I went out in a very big day, and you have to be very careful where you sit because, you know, waves come in sets. And on big days where there's big storms, you may have 4 or 5 or 6 waves in a set. And then there's a little lull, and then there'll be another set that comes in. But the bigger the swell, the bigger the storm, the more rapid the sets come in. Sometimes you'll have a channel, which is an area where it's smooth and you can paddle out to get out to the waves. But sometimes you actually have to go under the waves and dive down deep under the waves to get under the waves. And it's very, requires a lot of endurance to get out there. And the whole time you're holding your breath, you're getting knocked under the water. So you have to have a very large lung capacity. This is if you're surfing bigger waves. This is not for, you know, little 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot waves, maybe 4, but, you know, longboard on a sandy beach. That's a whole different experience. But this is very like high performance, extreme sport, I would call it. So the day I went out was a very, very large day. And I went out in a place that they refer to as a cheese grater. If you're familiar with a cheese grater, you know, if you're grating your cheese or you're grating up, like I talked about, grating up the olena, shredding it, right? Because the a'a, which is the pokey lava, it's sharp and pokey lava, so the name in Hawaii is a'a. The a'a lava was everywhere here, very sharp and very, very shallow, and there was no real way to get out to it. There was a boat dock, boat ramp, so you would jump into the boat ramp and you would paddle this way. You paddle out to get out to the break this way, but the shoreline this way was all this jagged a'a. So if you were to get pushed into it, you know, it could be really devastating. And so the water pitches up onto the reef, and then you take off on the wave here, and you surf down the wave. So I was paddling out, and a big set came, and I was sitting in too deep, too close to the reef. So sometimes what will happen is the water will suck up off of the reef, and it will be like dry under you. And I was sitting too deep, and it was bad. Let's just say I was sitting in a very bad position. Yeah, it wasn't good. So I had my little board, and I knew that it wasn't going to be good. So I just kind of pulled back. I knew I was going to go over, so you would go over the falls, but I was going to paddle back out to the outside to be safe so that I didn't end up in these jagged rocks. So getting back to the honu, or the sea turtle, there's tons of them. in Hawaii, and there were tons of them where we used to surf. And if you ever watch them, they are very peaceful when they swim. They're very slow moving, very peaceful, and they will sort of just flow with the tides, with the waves, and you can even watch them sort of bounce off the rocks from side to side, and just so peaceful, right? They just, I would say they just go with the flow. And there's an expression in surfing, and don't panic, right? So again, getting back to this idea of anxiety and stress that can make all situations worse, all medical conditions. Stress exacerbates all medical conditions. Stress can make everything, anything going on worse. And in a situation where you're surfing and it's critical and you literally are in a life or death situation, you can't panic. Like you have to stay calm, which is really hard to do when giant waves are coming at your head and you're about to go into a bunch of rocks. And so I was paddling as hard as I could, but it turned out to be like a 5 or 6 wave set, and I kept getting pushed back, and I just didn't have quite the strength to fight the ocean at that point. And so there was this moment in time, and I recall it, where I kind of called on Honu, or the little turtle, and I pictured Honu, and I imagined myself as Honu, as the turtle, and I had this image in my mind of this turtle just bouncing off of these rocks and how graceful it bounced. And that I thought to myself, if I go into the rocks, I want to be like Honu. I want to be like the turtle. I'm just going to bounce off the rocks. And I called on that spirit of that animal. Again, I imagined that in my mind. And as I went into the rocks, I did just sort of glide over them. I don't know how it happened. I really don't know. Like, I really don't know how it happened. I ended up with a slight scratch on my foot, and my board did not have any scratches on it. I sort of glided over the rocks, and I stood up. And I just stood up on these rocks, on this reef, and I walked off of the rocks, and the rocks are sharp, but your feet get very used to it because you're always hopping on these rocks to get out to the various surf spots on the island. And I remember there were, because there's the jagged lava rock, and then there is this sort of beyond that lava rock, there is sort of this little beach area where people were sitting. And I remember standing up with my board, and I remember people looking at me in just amazement and saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I just remember looking, and I just was so stunned. And I remember, saying, yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay. I had no idea how I was okay, but I was okay. And I actually went back in. I jumped off and went back in and surfed some more. But that was a very strange experience for me. And I do believe that, for me, I believe that the Honu spirit was there with me. And in a way, I don't know if you're familiar with the stories of Merlin, but, Merlin would change into these animals. And so for me, in my heart, in my mind, and my spirit, I feel like on some level I transformed into this little turtle and just glided across these rocks. But anybody who's ever rescued anybody or knows anything about panic and stress, it will make a situation worse. So the first thing that you do in an emergency situation is to take somebody out of this stress or out of this panic. And so for me, if we're talking about, maybe physiologically or in the mind, in the brain, what was going on, I think I was able to relax my body to that point where I had enough of those, maybe the serotonin in my brain and enough of those brain chemicals in my mind where I was able to relax my body to the point where I didn't have that tension. When we have that tension, or when we start kicking or flailing or doing any of these things, when we run a greater risk for injury. So the mind, the brain, doesn't distinguish between what is actually happening and what we are imagining, which is why like meditation practices or visualization practices or imagination or prayer or any of these things can be so effective. If we want to break it down into the scientific aspect of it, we would be looking at brain chemistry and electrical activity in the brain, and how being able to calm ourselves down actually releases these calming chemicals or neurotransmitters for the brain. So that's why if we take up a regular practice of this, we are actually able to reshape our brains. We have brain plasticity, which allows us to kind of shift our brain and heal our mind and heal our brain. And so then again, when we get into body, mind, soul, spirit, but body, mind, the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal column, is where all the information, that's the control center of the body, all the information that goes to all the cells, that goes to all the muscles, that goes to all the bones, that goes to all aspects of our body, is all controlled by the central nervous system. So brain health, mental health is very important for overall body wellness. And again, in the first class, I talked a little bit about Descartes and the separation of mind-body in the West. Mind-body, brain being the physiological, biological component that we associate mind with, but mind being our actual thinking. Thinking is actually a behavior that can be trained. We can train our behaviors. We can train our thinking patterns. There's a multitude of practices, such as reframing, self-talk, mindfulness, journaling, that can give us power over our own thinking. And this is not this idea of only think these positive things, only think positive. I hear this sometimes. That's a little elusive. We want to be realistic about the world. There's a lot of things happening in the world, but that being said, when we are able to gain power over our thoughts, we are able to use our brains as a tool to make change in our lives and the lives of others, as instead of having it like a runaway freight train and controlling us. It is not, it's a tool, and we can be in charge of it. And a lot of healing can come from that. And for those of you who don't know, I am also a hypnotherapist, and I work with hypnosis and the subconscious mind. And that I really got into that after my delving into neuroscience and understanding how the brain works, and how our conditioning and our associations have programmed us to respond and react to stimuli in particular ways that may be detrimental. So we create these behavioral patterns and habits based on our conditioning. And we are able to change our conditioning through certain practices. And as a hypnotherapist, part of that is me being able to help facilitate that in others and give them those tools to be able to do that. So in the wellness field, working in the wellness field, one of the big things that I've done is working with pain management, natural pain management and natural stress management, a lot of that through body work. I've worked in pain clinics and accident clinics and things like this. But the more I got into the neuroscience and understanding of pain and stress, because stress and pain kind of go hand in hand. When we're in pain, we have more stress. When we have more stress, we experience pain more. But pain is actually a perception. So yes, we have our nerve endings that take the information to the brain, but how we process that information is really the level at which we experience or don't experience pain. So it really stems from that place of perception, which is why mind and thinking is so potent and powerful, and brain biology, but brain and brain chemistry and electrical impulses. We can actually have practices that shift and change that chemistry. Chemistry at the basis, right, of our hormones, of our neurotransmitters, all of this information that our brain gives to our body to give our bodies the experience, whatever experience it is that it's having, managing our bodies. The yogis knew this, right? It's been 5,000 years of Ayurveda. The ancients knew this. It's now having a revival, has been for a little while, but you know, we have this scientific perspective, and now science has to come back and put it into terms that make sense. So that's my story of the Honu and the little turtle, and how I feel I was able to overcome this very scary situation and come out in one piece. And I'm going to leave you with one last story from my journeys into fish medicine. So again, you know, ancient Hawaiians had a really amazing system for their sustainable system for food production. You know, they had fish ponds where they would, around the palace grounds and around their communities, the fish ponds, they had a system where fish would swim in, and then they would be trapped in these fish ponds, and then they would breed, and then they would, you know, collect the fish from their fish ponds. They brought the pig over, and then they had their foods that they would grow, right? So they did have agriculture. They had the sweet potato and the kala, which is the poi, and then, you know, the various fruits, you know, banana, coconut, things like this, right? But as far as gathering, some of the, I mean, hunting and gathering, but I'd also say they were really quite agricultural. But again, with the system of animism, if you are fishing in the wild, if you're gathering in the wild, and I touched on that, this is a practice that Native Americans share, where you're asking permission to take either the plant or the animal if you are collecting or hunting and gathering. You are acknowledging that there is a spirit that exists within this plant or animal. And as I described, you know, even if we look at the kalo, it's such an important food source for the Hawaiians. They like actually trace their lineage back to a plant. And plants are just as sacred as animals. So that whether we're eating plant or we're eating animal, both lives are seen as being equally important, because again, we're looking at a bigger, broader system, and there's no hierarchical structure. Everything is very interdependent. So when there is an interdependence, and when you live, especially in an island community, especially on an island, sustainability becomes exceedingly important, because you cannot just I mean, I guess you can. The Polynesians were great explorers and navigators. They could have moved to other islands. And however, it's not as easy as migrating across a giant continent. And you don't know, maybe there might not be any other land masses within your very close vicinity. So when we look at Easter Island, right, they were wiped out. You can eat your way out of your existence if you live on an island, let's just say. So all life is valued and very sacred, and the interdependence of all things is acknowledged. And so before you take anything, you always pule and you ask permission. So when I took my fish medicine class with Kehao Keopuiva, we were out in Puako, which was a place that Papa Henry Avai went to often. He was down there in that area in North Kohala, on the Kohala coast, and fish medicine. So there's many different fish that are used for medicine. There's practices with the fish bones. You might use the fish bones, but if we think about bones, fish bones, there's a lot of calcium there, right? Minerals that are essential, and things of that nature. So again, all parts of plants and all parts of animals are used in medicinal practices. And so I shared my brief hunting story and fishing, so spearfishing. We went spearfishing again. I have yet to actually kill anything. Excuse me, I can't really bring myself to do it, but I'm able to clean it, or was. I don't really do that anymore. I don't live there anymore, but we were out, hopping on these little rocks and spearfishing. So we would jump off and swim with a, mask, snorkel, and a spear, and we would spearfish. And I had a very bizarre experience when I was out there. Excuse me just a minute. Sorry. So, we pule, we would pray, and we would ask permission if we could take these fish. And, when I've wildcrafted and I've been collecting herbs, there's definitely, like I said, a kind of a telepathic communication between yourself and the plant, where you definitely, if you tune in on that level, can sense whether or not you have permission from the plant to pick. But again, you're going into a different state of consciousness. So you're tuning into this electromagnetic energy, or this universal spirit energy, or the individual spirit. If we're talking about animism, you are telepathically communicating with that spirit. But in a plant, it's very more subtle experience than when we're talking about animals, because animals are so animated. And I think that we identify or maybe place them higher on the hierarchy because of our ethnocentricity, and that we identify with them because we are living and animated creatures, and so they seem more like us. So we probably, I think that in a lot of modern culture, we place the animals higher up on the hierarchy than we do the plants. Although the plants are very intelligent, and as science is studying more and more about like even fungi and mushrooms and trees and the way that they communicate through their tree root systems, or the way the fungi have these large communities and they have their forms of communication, maybe science is disproving a little bit of our hierarchy and starting to understand this interconnected nature. So we pule before we would do any kind of hunting, and so that includes spearfishing. And so I was swimming along the reef and seeing all sorts of fish, and had my spear and had this bizarre experience that the fish were talking to me. It was freaking me out a little bit. And Kehao was down the reef swimming, hunting. And I just was having this bizarre experience of these fish talking to me. And I remember one fish came in front of another fish as I was thinking about hunting it and talked to me. And I feel as though it was maybe a mental, I don't know if it's my mind thinking or an actual telepathic communication. But what I heard the fish say was, "You don't need this. You have plenty of food on the beach. Leave us alone. You don't need us for food. There's no reason to kill us," which was really bizarre for me. And I had a few other experiences I wish I would have written down. I had one experience where these little fish came out from the rocks and started biting at the tip of my spear. So all of these messages I was getting was saying, you shouldn't be here, and you shouldn't be hunting, and you shouldn't be killing us. And the truth was, I did not need them for food. It was a medicine class, and the lesson that I took was that I wasn't meant to hunt them that day. So I think at some point, I got to the point where I just started to feel a little freaked out, and I just got out of the water. It just felt very scary to me. I think we did have an experience where I got an OPE off the rock, and it was a really big OPE, like this big. An OPE is a limpet, so it's a shellfish that sticks to the rock. So I did not have a problem with that, and just ate that. You would just eat that right off of the rock. You would eat that fresh. We eat a lot of raw fish in Hawaii. You eat a lot of raw fish. Of course, the poke that they make is the raw fish, which is a traditional Hawaiian food. But when I got to the beach, I looked at Kehao, and he had his catch, and I just looked at him, and I was like, I couldn't. I felt that they were talking to me, and they were telling me not to, and so I couldn't. And he, really confirmed that, and he said that you did exactly what you were supposed to do. That's what it is. You are supposed to listen, and if you were not given permission, then you did the right thing and you listened. So he gave me his catch, which was an honor. Then I went home and prepared it, and that was an honor to have Kumu give me his catch. But for him to confirm to me that we do need permission. So I guess taking that full circle, there's some talks going on this weekend for World Environmental Day, and this, idea of sustainability. I want to bring back this idea of our environmental awareness. If you go to my website, I have multiple articles on the environment and nature that we are part of, not separate from, and that we have this interconnectedness, and that we're not listening to our spirit brothers and sisters on the planet, that we are not acting with reverence, and that when we fail to recognize this sacred aspect, the spirit aspect, the soul aspect of our existence, and that of the broader world, being that the microcosm and macrocosm are interconnected and intertwined and a reflection of one another. If we don't acknowledge that and respect that, then we basically kill ourselves off, which is kind of what we're seeing with the planet right now and the earth, which is probably why I got pulled out of that rainforest against my will, I say, to come here and share these stories with the wider world, so that hopefully we can raise the consciousness of this planet to a place where we can interact in a peaceful way and begin to have that reverence for one another and for all living things and all non-living things, being the rocks and the mountains and all of those other things that we share the planet with, right? We think on a microbial level, and if we think of our interconnected nature, they don't have any less of a right to exist than we do. One of the problems in Hawaii, when we were talking about the ohia trees and the rapid ohia death, and I spoke a bit about these ohia trees and that they were sacred to me, and that I would consider them to be a totem plant for me, or aumakua, is the nematodes. And I spoke briefly about those nematodes, but we're talking about soil microbes and the importance of the beneficial soil microbes for the health of the plants themselves, and that these herbicides, Roundup and glyphosate, destroying these soil microbes, which keep the health and vitality of the soil, which can kill a giant, beautiful 2,000-year-old tree because of this interconnectedness of microcosm and macrocosm, that these soil microbes are so important to the health of the plants. And so when we talk about modern agriculture, and we talk about the approach to monocrop farming, and we talk about using chemical fertilizers in the soil, it would be like us trying to survive off of just vitamin pills and no food. We need more sustenance than that. There needs to be this rich environment, rich with microbes and, worms, earthworms, that there's this diverse biome and all of these creatures that we don't see that have their own existence, that also sustain larger plants. And then again, we can even get beyond that when we go into trees and the oxygen that they produce for us, and the way that they clean carbon out of the air. And so we can learn a lot from concepts of animism and reverence and understanding of spirit nature, and that everything has a place and everything has a purpose. And so those are some stories, but bringing that back full circle to everything that we talked about, our health, our well-being, the concept of holistic wellness, the concept of mind, body, spirit, soul, is not exclusive of our broader environment, our human family, our non-human family, sentient beings, non-sentient beings, all of it. It's all interconnected. So it's this rippling out effect that I've spoken of, and this shifting of awareness, and this shifting of consciousness, and this raising of these vibrational frequencies, if you will, when we're talking about emotion, and when we're talking about depression or anger or these slow-moving energies, and raising them into this as like a bodhisattva, raising them into this higher level of joy and compassion, or agape, or brotherly, sisterly love, this love vibration, which is that heart chakra, which is that healing vibration of compassion, not being sympathy, not feeling sorry for, but compassion in that empathetic sense. And when I say empathy, I'm very careful with the word empathy. You don't want to go into somebody else's trip. You don't want to go into somebody else's pain and suffering, but you can identify with it. It's part of this human experience that we all have. And when we come from that place of compassion, we're able to shift. So when people are in deep despair, in deep hatred, in deep anger, that's when these acts of violence to self and others happen on the planet. So our words are very important, and what we put into the world is very, very important. So I think that being kind is very, very important, and watch what you say to others, because the words that you use may either pull them up and lift them up or drag them down. And when people are in very low places of despair, we perpetuate this hatred and violence and anger on the planet. And so I'm going to leave you with that. Again, last week I left you with the practice of Ho'oponopono, which is, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you. I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you. Yeah, so sending that out to others, shifting the planet, being aware of our spiritual brothers and sisters, understanding that Gaia and this beautiful planet on which we reside is part of us, and we are part of it. And we cannot remove ourselves from our broader world. And again, what is going on internally reflects externally, and that we do have impact and that we do have influence. And even if we don't feel as though we are making a difference, just by the way we carry ourselves in the world, just by maybe shifting that one person, helping them out of a dark place, they in turn help others, and so it goes. So that is part of an evolutionary, revolutionary shifting process. Okay, well, thank you. Any questions from today at all for anybody? No? Okay. All right. I hear somebody's microphone. Is that Raj? No? All right. Well,
It's a
I'm
very
going to.
interesting thing what you're telling about your travel, your friends. It's really interesting for us to have this experience with you.
Yeah,
I
it
wish,
was a very big learning experience.
yes, of course. It's really interesting, and I hope the people join in and see what is the other side of the world with frequencies and lights and what all things are there. I hope more and more people join in.
I hope so too. I'll send that out. I hope so too. I hope people understand the importance of it. I think that humanity is at a critical point right now, and we are going to have to mature as a species. I believe we need to put aside our differences, mature a little bit, and understand the importance of our actions in the world a little bit more, I think, if we want to survive as a species, in my opinion.
Yeah. Anyways, thank you so much for the session.
Thank you.
Yes, and on 16th, I think you're not available. As you put in the message.
Correct. I apologize. I have to go in for a minor surgery. So
Yeah, no issues. God bless you for that. And,
thank you so much.
We look forward for the next session next week.
Thank you so much. And again, I just would put out there for anyone, if there are any topics you'd like me to touch on in the next session, you have my email. Please feel free to email me with that information, and I will be happy to touch on that. Any questions, any comments, or any topics of interest, and I will do my best to provide those answers for you. So I just want to leave you with that. Aloha, have a beautiful day, and be good, do good. Until next week, aloha.
Aloha. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.